On entend encore un peu de public qui est en... Bon, on commence la soirée. Bonsoir à tous et à toutes. Bienvenue à la troisième rencontre associée à l'exposition Absalon que vous pouvez visiter si vous ne l'avez pas encore déjà fait ici au CAPC. Donc, dans le cadre d'une collaboration entre Arc en Rêve et le CAPC, nous avons invité 3 architectes, 3 penseurs de l'architecture pour lesquels le travail d'Absalon a été extrêmement important. Et donc ce soir, nous arrivons donc à la conclusion de ce petit cycle de présentation. Il nous avait paru, depuis la découverte dans la programmation du CPC de cette exposition, qu'il était absolument fondamental de tisser des ponts entre les différentes disciplines et de montrer jusqu'à quel point et comment cet artiste a été important dans la réflexion de différents auteurs. Donc ce soir, je suis extrêmement heureux. Je me présente, je suis Fabrizio Galanti, le directeur d'Arc en Rêve. Et je suis extrêmement heureux que ce soir, la clôture de ce cycle se fasse avec notre invité, Pier Vittorio Aureli, qui donc va nous parler à partir de la cellule, va nous présenter une série de réflexions architecturales. Pour ceux qui étaient ici avec nous il y a une semaine, en occasion de la précédente conférence de Soc Studio, c'est quand même assez intéressant aussi de reconnaître des traces de continuité dans la réflexion. Les invités de la semaine dernière avaient admis d'avoir été influencés profondément par les textes de Pier Vittorio sur Absalon, qui les avait un peu menés à découvrir l'œuvre de cet auteur. Donc c'est aussi pour nous une manière, cette conférence, de montrer quelles sont les affiliations, les parrainages, les continuités dans un dialogue qui est continu à partir des œuvres. Alors ce soir, Pier Vittorio Aureli, qui est cofondateur de l'agence d'architecture Dogma avec Martino Tattara, donc 2 Italiens comme d'autres transplantés à l'étranger en Belgique depuis longtemps à Bruxelles. Donc nous rejoignons ici aujourd'hui depuis Bruxelles. Généralement, on ne fait jamais de énoncé du CV des invités parce que tout le monde peut facilement les trouver sur Google, mais nous aimons plutôt expliquer mieux pourquoi nous souhaitons participer d'un dialogue avec les personnes qui sont avec nous. Et bon, Pier Vittorio, depuis très longtemps, mène une réflexion très fondamentale pour la pensée architecturale entre théorie de l'architecture et de l'histoire, entre une attitude politique qu'on souhaiterait être plus ample, diffusée, vraiment avec une compréhension des enjeux politiques qui sont associés à l'architecture, donc avec un ajournement de la théorie marxiste par rapport à la ville, par rapport à la production architecturale, et tout en étant un agitateur de pensée, surtout avec un rôle de professeur, de pédagogue dans le sens ancien du terme, qui l'amène à enseigner d'une manière assez vorace entre Londres à l'Architecture Association, Yale, Université des États-Unis, et à Lausanne. Donc c'est un peu cette capacité de jouer avec différents registres, donc l'écriture, le projet d'ailleurs tellement puissant qu'il arrive à se faire publier par El Croquis avec très peu de bâtiments construits, si je ne me trompe pas aucun, ce qui est une nouveauté pour ce magazine, et l'enseignement, que ça nous paraît effectivement une pensée architecturale absolument majeure, et qu'aujourd'hui on va mieux comprendre à travers, une porte d'entrée peut-être latérale, qui nous semble aussi être la preuve d'une curiosité qui n'est pas du tout censée de se limiter à des terrains connus, mais toujours avec un désir d'observer un peu au-delà de ce que les disciplines, de ce que les clivages nous forceraient à penser comme très, très fermés, au contraire très ouvertes. Alors, la conférence sera en anglais, donc pour ceux qui n'ont pas encore récupéré des casques, vous savez, il y a des casques disponibles pour la traduction simultanée, et après les questions pourront être posées soit en anglais, soit en français. Donc Pier Vittorio, merci beaucoup pour être avec nous ce soir, et à toi la parole.
Thank you, Fabrizio, and thank you all for coming, even though it's raining, so it's not always pleasant to come to a venue when it's raining. So the title of my lecture tonight is Iconografia Cella, which is the title of this drawing, which we made at Dogma, I think last year. We were asked by the exhibition curators of the ETH to actually make a drawing about confinement, which, as you might suspect, was the theme of the last year. And we decided to write an essay, as we usually do with the drawing. We call these drawings analogous maps, which are basically a text made of drawings. In this case, the drawing is a composition of plans of cells, actually from the Roman cubiculum through actually workers' lodging until actually micro flats. And in fact, this drawing was a kind of summary of a very long-term research that we have made at Dogma, and which has been partially published into books. One called The Room of One's Own, which was an attempt to reconstruct history of the private room. And the other one, the other publication is called Loveless, and it's an atlas of minimum dwelling, which, as you know, is a very important typology that came into being between the 19th and the 20th century, and seems to actually survive until to this day, when in fact apartments and housing are becoming smaller and smaller. Actually, both these publications were an attempt to criticize domestic space. I think domestic space is something we still take for granted. We somehow are very familiar with domesticity, and sometimes things that are very familiar are even the most insidious. And of course, we were trying to actually show how both the room and the minimum dwelling, which is actually also the cell, are really ambivalent architectural spaces. They can be both refuge, even radical forms of life, but they can also be traps. They can also be places of domestication, of imprisonment. And in a way, for us, really this ambivalence of the room, the private room and the cell is also the ambivalence of architecture itself, which, as you might know very well, is something that can enable, but something that can also constrain. So in this work, actually, the work of Absalon, the Israeli-French artist Absalon, was very important, very influential. In fact, one of his cells was also a case study in our book, Loveless. We encountered his work many years ago, actually, before actually his work became maybe well known, especially after the 2013 exhibition in Berlin and Rotterdam. And the reason why Absalon's work was very important for us is because, in a way, Absalon is one of the very few artists or architects who have been consistently interested in the idea of dwelling and habitation, but without actually resorting to domestic space. And if you think today, when we talk about habitation, of course, domesticity is the almost fait accompli of what we can think about habitation. And Absalon actually proposed a series of models, a series of ways of inhabit, of course, more theoretical than practical, that in a way were implicitly or explicitly very critical, very much against the idea of domesticity. Of course, this has a lot to do with also the biography of Absalon himself. You might know that he was born in Israel. He actually was trained in a boarding school that was attached to, I think, the Air Force, the Israeli Air Force. This experience was very traumatic, as you can imagine. And after that, he was living in in a small hut, in a small cabin that he built himself on the beach, not far away from where he was born. And for a few years, actually, he maintained himself alone in this cabin by making and selling small jewelry. And of course, after he left, he went to Paris and there actually became an artist. But as you know, his career as an artist lasted for very few years, from the late 80s, I think 87 to 93, when he died of HIV. And in fact, all his work as an artist was produced under the shadow of this disease. I think he knew it actually from very early on. And so all his work is really marked by this very exceptional situation. And of course, we shouldn't forget that the late 80s, early 90s, the peak of the HIV crisis. And this crisis was not just, as every pandemic is not just a natural thing, it was also very constructed by institutions that for a very long time marginalized and even negate the impact of this disease. So in a way, his critique of domesticity was also a critique of institutions. It was a critique of the state, was a critique of the family as institutions that in a way, once they are established, tend to marginalize many subjects that do not conform to these institutions. So in a way, it's interesting that from the beginning, the work of Absalon is really obsessed with this idea of dwelling and habitation. All of his work actually is about this topic, and I really like these models, which you can see also in the exhibitions, because you see that at first he's really trying to address habitation through furniture. And it's interesting that this furniture is bigger than the space that is supposed to contain. So he really tried to build spaces that are very constrained, that somehow force the dweller to be very aware of how to position things, how to move things around. And of course, as you know, actually, perhaps the most important part of his work is the famous 6 prototypes of cells, which actually were designed for himself. In fact, Absalon, as you might know, was a very tall person. So certainly was not the average, if there is an average, let's say, human figure. So everything that was designed for this cell was bespoke basically to his own body. The spaces actually were very small, which means that once you were inside, no one else could enter the space. So there was a very strong, really position about solitude as a right, as something that somehow is not imposed, but is actually searched, is really wanted. And also by having this very compressed space, the idea of Absalon was that once you were inside this space, you would become aware of your gestures, because you had to very much be careful how you to move within this space. So there is a search almost of a rituality of dwelling, a way to really become aware of what you can do and what you cannot do. And of course, this made the cells very specific objects that are somehow moving from art to architecture, but for me, even more than architecture, to inhabitation. Inhabitation really as an art, as a way to really be artist with one's own body and action and life. But actually, for me, the most interesting work by Absalon, the one where really his project becomes actually very explicit, very evident, is this short video, which maybe you have seen. It's called Solutions. And it's a video where Absalon staged this room, which is open towards the viewer, so it's almost like a theatrical stage. And he performed these 6 typical actions, actually very mundane actions. Of course, what it becomes actually quite evident is the contrast between the space, which is very constrained, and the body of Absalon, which is very imposing. Nevertheless, his actions actually are really mundane. There is nothing really extraordinary or nothing really theatrical. And yet, the way in which they are presented to the viewer with this video somehow makes clear that he's trying to really emphasize, to give an emphasis to these actions, almost like a ritual emphasis, as if, like an actor or like a monk, he's actually trying to really reacquire gestures and movements that we always perform without being aware of, as something that really constitute a certain form of life. And in that sense, for me, is really this work of Absalon that inspired me a few years ago to revisit a very important and yet often misunderstood topic that actually has a lot of connections to architecture, which is the topic of ascetism. Of course, something that is very controversial, that especially in the last 15 years, after years of austerity and budget cuts, I think we all have become, in one way or another, ascetic persons. But the original meaning of asceticism was certainly not suffering or being deprived of things. Asceticism, as you know, comes from the Greek skeo, which means to exercise, to train. And asceticism was really a practice through which people were really trying, by practicing things, practicing life, reacquire a certain control of themselves, a certain care of themselves. Perhaps the archetypical ascetic person, especially maybe not today, but in ancient times, was the philosopher. The philosopher was really someone who was expected to not just theorize and talk about things, but also practice them. So in a way, the work of philosophy was understood not simply as a matter of logos, but also as a matter of bios, as a matter of life, as a somehow living according to a certain idea or a certain ideal. And of course, it's exactly this model of asceticism that became extremely important, especially with the rise of Christianity, with the early Christians, who actually, and later on monks, Christian monks, but not only actually Christian monks, also monks of other religions, who actually use ascetic practices to really train themselves to be in control of their own senses and to live a life in full awareness. And of course, this model of ascetic practices was defined by a very important thinker of the 20th century, Max Weber, as otherworldly asceticism. Otherworldly asceticism is an asceticism that has no goal outside of itself. It's an asceticism that has not to do with work, with labor, with punishment or self-discipline, but more with a desire to really be aware mentally and physically of oneself. And actually, Max Weber defined this form of asceticism in his famous book, which I'm sure you all know, The Protestant Ethics and the Birth of Capitalism, because he opposed to this form of asceticism a modern form of asceticism, which he defined as inner-worldly asceticism, which in fact was not an asceticism for the sake of itself, for the sake of the individual person, but an asceticism as a form of abnegation to work, abnegation to production, abnegation to entrepreneurial, let's say, life, which Weber really identified with the rise of the Protestant religion, where salvation was not actually coming by itself, but was coming really from the person who was actually committed to a life of work. And of course, the image of the merchant, the entrepreneur, the Renaissance entrepreneur, who actually is prominently portrayed in from Dürer to Hans Holbein, as a kind of hero, as a modern hero, became really like for Weber the image of the inner-worldly ascetic devotion to a life, a productive life, a life of work. Of course, with the rise of the industrial civilization and even today, this form of inner-worldly asceticism is no longer simply a matter of, let's say, an elite, but has become a universal way of life. Asceticism means that we are able to adapt ourselves to all kinds of circumstances in order to survive, in order to remain, to sustain ourselves. So it has to do with adaptability, with creativity, but these faculties are always geared to being productive and being exploited in a way. So, and of course, this way of life often comes with these spaces which we have become familiar, you know, small rooms, small lodgings, where actually the whole, let's say, device through which we dwell are clustered, concentrated in very small square meters. So in a way, this shift of the cell from a voluntary or asceticism, from a voluntary, let's say, way of life to an imposed way of life can be summarized through a dilemma, which I think is really the dilemma of the cell. So what I call the cell ascetic dilemma. On one hand, the cell as a voluntary act of self-discipline, as a chosen way of life, which I think is very well represented by the work of Absalon. But also the cell as inescapable cellularization of society, as a way in which society is constantly organized by disciplining bodies, confining bodies through actually cells and conduits, to use a very famous series of paintings made by the American artist Peter Halley. I'm sure you know his work. He's a painter, abstract painter that has constantly represented this motif of the cell and the conduit by arguing that this is, in a way, represents our human condition, where we are constantly moving through conduits, which can be the streets, the highways, the infrastructure that we use to move around, and of course our terminal places, our homes, our rooms, which in fact act as involuntary cells. So in a way, for me, the dilemma of the cell, and especially the ascetic way of life, is exactly between these two poles, between these two paradigms, between self-discipline and, of course, the cellularization of society. And it's exactly this, let's say, dilemma that, that I would like to use in order to frame a short history of the cell as one-person living space. So in a way, I will show you actually few examples through history of this way of life, where, of course, asceticism becomes a fundamental content of architecture. Of course, in no way I want to give you an exhaustive history, that I will miss a lot of important examples, but I just want to give you an idea of this way of life, especially how it's constantly moving from these two conditions that I described before. Of course, solitary living as a way of life becomes actually important with the rise of monasticism. And actually, we have traces of this way of life from very early on, even before Christianity. There is evidence that this way of life existed even in the 3rd millennium BC. And of course, the name monasticism comes later with the rise of Christian monasticism, and come from monk, which in Greek means monachos, solitary. And one of the very early known forms of mass monasticism is certainly Buddhism, which arose between the 5th and 4th century. Buddha himself was inspired by the, let's say, practice of the Vanvasi, the forest dwellers, people who actually choose to reject property terrestrial, let's say, preoccupations, family, households, and were wandering through areas that were not lived by people or villagers. And often they spend their life in caves, like in this case, living off alms from other people or from things that they could find around. But actually, Buddha himself realized that this way of life, this solitary way of life, and this was always the problem of this way of living, was very difficult, if not impossible. To live alone is, of course, a very strong ideal, but on a material level becomes really challenging, as you can imagine. And so he recommended his followers, to form communities known as the vihara, and the vihara were in fact monastic communities. Here you see a very beautiful example, which are the very famous vihara in the Nasik cave. There are several of them, where you really see in very explicit terms the diagrams of monastic way of life, where there is this dichotomy between the collective space and the cell. The cell, of course, is the space of the individual, and the whole is the represents the moment of collective life. And the two terms are very much one against the other. I mean, they are not actually merged. So that in a way there is this aspect of reciprocity, but somehow the monk can still pursue the idea of solitary living. And what I very much like is that the form of the cell is given by the body of the monk. So the bed really becomes the measure through which the cell actually is organized. Of course, in the West, actually, a very important moment for monasticism is the 4th century, when this way of life started to emerge in a region which at the time was known as Syria. Actually, Syria was not what now we identify with a specific place of the Near East, but it was all this region that more or less coincided with the Fertile Crescent. It's here that actually early monastic communities start to emerge between Egypt and, of course, Syria. And actually, it's interesting because at that time, this region, unlike actually the western part of the Roman Empire, was booming from an economic point of view. There was a lot of agricultural development. And it makes quite clear that monasticism really arose both as a sort of refusal of the institutionalization of Christianity as an official cult, which happened exactly a little bit before, but also was a refusal to be part of communities that were more and more geared to this ethos of productivity. So monasticism was really a way to withdraw, especially to withdraw from the social obligation to work. From very early on, there are two paradigms of monasticism. What we can call the Syrian paradigm and the Egyptian paradigm. The Syrian paradigm actually was very much focused on the model of the hermitage, of the hermit. And of course, Simeon the Stylitz is perhaps one of the most paradigmatic example. So people who really choose to live alone, often they would find places in ruins of buildings. So there is this, of course, legend that they would sit on top of columns, which is not partially true. I mean, they were sitting actually on top of buildings in order to actually reinforce their solitary way of life. But actually, they often depended a lot on the, let's say, loyalty of communities that were living around. So hermits actually would always idealize their own exit from society as a way to live in the desert. But this desert have to always be strategically not far away from communities that, of course, were allow these people to survive, even if these people were constantly meditating and not working. In fact, this way of life often arose a lot of criticism because people realized that somehow asceticism could only work because there were people, in fact, supporting them. So, in fact, against this paradigm, there was another paradigm of monasticism, which is the Egyptian paradigm, which is very much represented by Pachomius. Pachomius is really one of the first monk to realize the importance of reciprocity, actually, in the monastic life. But also, in the Egyptian paradigm, what looms large was, beside meditation, also work. That monks, in order to fulfill their own way of life, they also have to devote themselves not just to meditation, but also to self-sustain, to self-sustenance. And so work actually becomes also very important for the Egyptian monks. So in a way, in this beginning of Christian monasticism, we have a set of dilemmas that are really important, which I think are fundamental to really understand also the evolution of the cell. We have the dilemma between hermitage and cenobium. Hermitage is living, let's say, alone, and cenobium is living together. So monks were constantly going back and forth between these two models, try to understand a way of life that would not compromise too much hermitage, but would somehow also rely on some form of reciprocity. And of course, the whole history of monasticism is a constant back and forth between these two conditions. But then we have also another dilemma that became actually quite pressing for early monks, and I think today even for later on, which is the dilemma between meditation and labor. The fact that, of course, to be a monk was to devote oneself to meditation and renounce to any material or terrestrial concern. But of course, then self-sustenance required labor, either the labor of monks themselves or the labor of someone else, maintaining their way of life. And we will see how this dilemma actually led monasticism to be compromised quite with very important institutions of power. So it's interesting to see, in fact, that early monastic communities would organize themselves as clusters of autonomous cells. This model is known as the Laura, and Lauras actually were loose communities of monks that would spend most of their time alone and congregate only occasionally, especially for mass, but also for other, let's say, communal activities like baking, cooking, sometimes also for other taking care of themselves, let's say. But somehow by having the cells self-standing and detached from one another, the idea was to maintain as much as possible the hermitage model. But it was exactly in Egypt where, in fact, the idea of community started to become more preeminent, that this model actually slowly started to form much more rigid, let's say, collective patterns. This has to do also with the fact that once monks started to congregate together, there was the necessity of a rule. And as you might know, the rule is a fundamental device through which monks really practice their own ascetic way of life. Of course, rules actually, they're very interesting, and they were very simple. So they were not very complex. There were not many rules, at least until the Benedictine rule. And often these rules were inspired by specific biographies of monks, of exemplary monks. So in a way, they were simple and also adaptable. So they were not defined once and for all. Rules were always open to adaptation. But of course, this adaptation was constantly, let's say, geared to the model of apostolic life, which was in fact rejection of properties, rejection of material concerns. And of course, this became increasingly difficult to maintain because, of course, once you have a lot of people living together, on the contrary, there are a lot of material concerns and there are a lot of organizational concerns. And in fact, at a certain point, monks became really skillful organizers of almost like labor camps, which allow actually their self-sufficiency. But still, actually, until I would say the 9th century AD, we can still see this kind of constant struggle between the idea of eremitic life, the idea of meditation and worship, and the idea of living together. This is actually one of the most extraordinary examples of Irish monasticism, where this kind of dichotomy is very present. The Augustinian monastery of Skellig Michael, which was built on top of an island, not far away from the coast. So this idea of really isolation, but a strategic isolation that is not too far away from, let's say, some community that can eventually allow also these monks to have a more secular interface. And you see actually how the monastery really, in this case, try to negotiate this idea of solitary living and communal living. And this was really a main concern for monks, how to combine, how to create a balance between these two ways of life. Of course, this balance was completely destroyed with the rise of the Benedictine rule and the Benedictine monastery. As you know, the rule of Benedict became the universal template of Christian monasticism from the 8th, 9th century, although the rule was actually written before. Benedict actually was a big admirer of hermits, but he, like Buddha, he also realized that the hermit way of life was very difficult to sustain. So he somehow advocated for the opposite, for monks to really form very stable communities. So for Benedict, actually, the idea of stabilitas loci, the stability of the place, was actually very, very important. But also he said two very important things. One, that of course monks, beside worshipping and meditating, they also had to work. So work became really a fundamental way to organize even the structure of the daily life of monks. And the other very important thing, as you can see from this plan of an early Benedictine monastery, a very important thing was, of course, that monks would sleep all together. Somehow, in the Benedictine monastery, the idea of solitary living is gone, is completely erased, and monks literally live communal life from beginning to the end, which, of course, as you can imagine, resulted in a very stressful kind of condition. And there are all kinds of discussions about whether to go back to the idea of the solitary or the cell. And this debate will never end. Actually, until today, monks are still debating this question of whether privacy should be allowed or not in a monastic community. But actually, there was also another problem with Benedictine monasteries. As you might know, especially after the Carolingian reform, they became very important places of political and economic power. De facto, they became like factories, as you can see from this very famous example, which is the ideal Benedictine monastery drafted in the 9th century. So this is actually the monastery proper, and then the monastery was surrounded by all kinds of economic and productive activities that actually allow, of course, monks to be self-sufficient, but also allow the monastery to accumulate wealth that was redistributed also with the other monastic communities. And it's interesting because the more this condition of the monastery became dominant, the more the cloister became the very fundamental form through which the monastery was organized. In a way, the cloister became a way to seclude the spaces of the monks from all the other spaces of the monastery. So in a way, the monks would not exit the cloister, so all their daily spaces, like the refectory, the dormitory, which you see here, you see the beds of the dormitory, the cellar, the latrine. So all these spaces were accessible from the cloister, and the cloister was accessible to the rest of the monastic compound by this very small passage. So in a way, the cloister really served to create this kind of illusion of seclusion and solitary life against the fact that, in fact, the monastery was, in fact, a city that included all kinds of productive and economic activities. So it was against this kind of model of the monastery as a city, as a compound of economic and productive activities that starting from the 11th century, there is a movement that tried to recuperate the original idea of the monastery as hermitage. There are two very interesting examples of this model. One, which is actually the Camaldolese hermitage, where in fact monks again congregated together, but each of them living in one cell, although these cells actually were very big, and actually they were almost like small houses, as you can see actually here. So this was the proper cell, the bed, the scriptorium, and then there was this interesting space, a corridor, that would serve the monk as a kind of meditation walk. And then there were all kinds of spaces like a small oratory, a storage, a workshop. So in a way, the idea was that the monk would spend most of his time inside this space. And there was a garden, which was not productive, was a garden for meditation. And so in a way, this would allow monks to live together for most of the time and congregate only occasionally with the other monks. Where this model actually became really important, and I'm sure you know this example, was the Carthusian monastery, which in fact really tried to combine the cenobium and the hermitage in one form, by in fact having the cells of the fathers in fact into small, let's say, houses of 2 or 3 stories with a garden, completely enclosed and grouped around a cloister. So the cloister really represents this idea of the communal, the communion of the monks, but each monk lived most of his time inside a very secluded space. And you know that this became a fundamental, very influential model for Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier visited the Carthusian monastery of Ema in Tuscany, near Florence, and that kind of this very extreme combination of solitary living and collective life became a kind of obsession through all his actually work as an architect. And it's interesting that the Carthusian cell was actually quite big for one person. There were actually many spaces, and the idea of having many spaces was to somehow almost suggest to the monk how to organize the daily life in time. So the monk knew that at a certain moment in time he had to dwell in one of those spaces. So in a way, the plan actually of the cell almost acted as a kind of chronotope, in a way suggesting really the passage of time through space. And of course, this kind of attention to the interior, which is actually very unusual for a medieval, let's say, dwelling, this attention to organization of space, to its really regular, almost rational composition, is seen by many historians as one of the very early attempts to build a coherent housing scheme, an issue that became very, very important, especially starting from the 19th century, 19th century, when somehow this very well-organized household was considered not just a privilege of few, but really as a kind of template for, especially for for working class people, as I will show you in some example later on. So perhaps this is really the good time to move from the monastic cell to its secularization as a place of secular living. And it's interesting that the secularization of the cell happened first in the houses of wealthy people, especially in people who were living in the very large houses like palazzis. Palazzos was really the aristocratic residence in Italy, and later on this was exported in many other places in Europe and around the world. And of course, life in the palace or palazzo, or let's say in the hotel, was a very ceremonial kind of life, a very public kind of life. And this pushed actually many residents, wealthy residents, male of course, to construct spaces where they could isolate themselves from this very intense social and public life. So maybe the most well-known example of this kind of space was the Studiolo. But here actually you see an interesting example of a proto-example of one-room apartment designed by Cornelis Meyer in the late 17th century, and published in his book Del Fabbricar Comodo, where he suggests really wealthy people to build micro apartments in order to really somehow be able to seclude themselves from these very large compounds that were their basically premises. And it's interesting how he compressed all kinds of furniture into actually the walls of this very small space. In a way, he really understand that furniture has to be really almost part of the architecture and somehow engulf the entire space of the room. But of course, the secular institution that really made the one person living space a very strong archetype was certainly the prison reform that took place actually between the late 18th century and early 19th century, when in fact imprisonment was optimized in order to control better prisoners, and so to not have them living together in large spaces, which was often the way in which people were imprisoned, but to have them actually living in solitary confinement. As you know, this is a reform that took place starting actually in England in the late 19th century, and then became actually the norm in the actually late 19th century, where in fact prisoners would be inhabit solitary confinement, and this of course was a way also to reduce drastically their social relationship with the other prisoners. So reformers were convinced that in this way the prisoner would think more about his or her actions by being alone most of the time. So there was also a kind of psychological kind of punishment, which consisted really in secluding the prisoner as much as possible. But it's interesting that almost at the same time, this type of habitation was also theorized as a form of lodging, as a form of dwelling, especially for what in England at that time were known as the laboring or laborer classes, which were in fact the dispossessed peasants that had to actually work for a wage for someone else. And of course, as you might know, in the 18th century, especially after the enclosures, there was a huge housing crisis. There were a lot of people homeless. And of course, it's at this point that philanthropists and architects start to imagine how to house these homeless people by offering them like a minimum form of dwelling, which often consisted in simple cells that nevertheless were equipped with basic infrastructures like privy or let's say a fireplace. But actually the cells were really, which could multiply and form in fact houses, were designed in order to not have people working inside these spaces. So this is a very important difference from the monastic cells that we have seen before, where the idea was that the monk would live and work within his own house. That's actually why these cells were actually quite big. In this case, of course, the idea is that you use the cell only to rest, and then you work outside under a wage. So you don't work for yourself, you work for someone else. And therefore, the cell has to be, or the room or the house have to be, the lodging have to be as small as possible, so that you can only use it for reproduction and not for production. This is actually very much visible in this very extreme example of a lodging, which was designed by a very important philanthropist, philanthropist of course between quote unquote, called Henry Roberts. He's actually not a very well-known figure within architecture, but he proposed very influential lodgings for lower class dwellers. And among them, one of the most extreme is this lodging house where workers were given a very small room. And the idea was that these rooms were not available during the day, so workers could only use these rooms during the night. That's why they were so small that you could only have a bed, and some of them didn't even have a window. So there was really this idea that these cells were not for dwelling, actually were simply for sleeping, and sleeping not for very long hours. And of course there was some communal service downstairs on the ground floor. But the idea was, of course, that the individual space, the space of privacy, was actually the minimum necessary, actually, and also no more than one person could live in this cell. But actually, in this short history of the cell, perhaps the most provocative, the most, in my opinion, radical. Scenario arose actually with one form of life that we can call hotel living, which of course in the last 56 years have kind of disappeared. I mean, of course, the hotels still exist, but they are for tourists, and people actually don't stay for a very long time. But actually, since the between 19th century and the 1960s, hotel living was a way of life, a very permanent way of life for many people. And of course, this way of life was actually, it arose as a very commercial form of living. So there was nothing utopian or, let's say, socially progressive in it. It was simply a form of commodification, let's say, of lodging. But of course, because it was so, as you will see, anti-domestic, it became a threat. And this is actually the reason why at a certain point it kind of disappeared. One of the very early form of modern hotel living was the boarding house. Boarding houses were not hotels, they were private houses which were actually have rooms that were rented to strangers, to people from outside the family. In United States, actually, this way of life became very important in cities like New York or Boston or San Francisco. In the 19th century, many people actually were living in boarding houses. And of course, this way of life became so popular that at a certain point it was considered dangerous. It was considered dangerous because it was considered very much anti-domestic, as I said before, especially because within boarding houses, domestic labor was professionalized. Domestic labor is something that, especially with the rise of modern domesticity, was considered a duty of family, especially women, and it was considered a labor of love, something that you would do, let's say, without expecting any remuneration, because only the work outside the home was actually remunerated. And this is actually why the boarding houses were considered very dangerous places, because they were really attacking this ideology of the house as a place of the labor of love. And this actually, and another reason was that often these boarding houses were owned and run by women who were really like managers and the entrepreneurs of boarding house, and hence you have posters like this one, which were really trying to stigmatize the landlady as a kind of threat to, in fact, society. So this is actually why at a certain point boarding houses actually disappear. Of course, you have to imagine that these ways of life were constantly under the radar of, within the radar of reformers and policymakers that always at a certain point managed to repress this very successful, but of course dangerous phenomenon. And of course, a replacement of the boarding house becomes the hotel, the more kind of professional run hotel. And hotels actually, especially in the United States, but also in Europe, in Germany, especially in England, they became a very important staple kind of house in cities. Actually, in United States, in cities like New York, 1/3 of middle-class people were living, in fact, in hotels. Of course, hotels were at first places for upper middle-class residents. They were very expensive, of course, like, for example, the Plaza Hotel. All the domestic activities were professionalized, were paid. And in fact, hotels could be just small rooms, but also apartments, as you can see here, with only one thing missing, which was the kitchen, of course. But of course, this way of life became so dominant also because in 19th century, early 20th century, American cities, North American cities, there is a lot of social mobility, a lot of clerks and, let's say, secretaries, let's say, white-collar workers were moving very frequently from city to city. And they had only two options. One was to live in tenements, which, of course, was not something they would desire to, or buy a house or rent a single-family house, which was too expensive. So by default, hotels really became the only way to afford living in cities. And of course, at that point, all kinds of hotels started to proliferate, not only for upper class, but also for middle and even working class people, as you can see from this notorious example, which is the National Hotel in San Francisco, where in fact rooms were, again, very small, and the only source of light was this very small shaft. So to compress as many rooms as possible in one block. Also, you have to understand that at that time, of course, the price of land is rising. And of course, to maintain hotels cheap, like in the case of the rooming house, density was really the only way to solve this problem. In spite of all these, let's say, controversial aspects, hotel living really became a very radical threat to social norms. Especially, it gave space to misfits, to outcasts, to people who actually were not conforming to a proper, normal, between quote-unquote, way of life. For example, it was a space where women, for the first time, could claim the right to solitude, to living alone, living not in families as married women. And of course, this is a condition that is very well captured in Edward Hopper paintings. And what I really like about these paintings is that there is this sense of uprootedness, abstraction, almost a sense of alienation, but also a sense of comfort, a sense of liberation. Now, again, this ambivalence that we have described at the beginning. Actually, who really captured this ambivalence of the cell, of the solitary living, was the poet, critic, architectural critic, and art critic Karel Teige, who in 1932 published a very famous book, which also was a very important inspiration for our work on this topic, minimum dwelling. And Teige actually really understood that minimum dwelling, there was nothing radical or utopian. It was really a kind of typologies that, as you have seen, arose with the pauperization of living conditions of the working class. But at the same time, he saw in this type of living, the minimum dwelling, a kind of revolutionary critique to domestic space. And in fact, the book was published as a polemic against the Siam idea of the house for minimum existence, the so-called existence minimum, which was, as you know, an attempt by modern architects to reduce as much as possible the dimensions of the home, so that to make homes more economically more efficient and affordable. And of course, the critique of Teige was that the problem with minimum dwelling was existence minimum was that there were reduction of bourgeois domestic spaces to very small dimensions. So in a way, although they were small, somehow they were still preserving this kind of normative, heteronormative character of the domestic space as a space bespoke to the nuclear family, where all the functions of the home, like cooking, cleaning, are somehow privatized within domestic space. So in opposition to this idea of existence minimum, he proposed minimum dwelling as a space where there are individual rooms, individual cells, and these cells are somehow inhabited by everyone, whether you are part of a family or outside of a family, whether you are an adult or, let's say, a child, whether you are a female or male or any other, let's say, kind of person, and where, in fact, all the other typical domestic functions are shared and socialized. And for Kaige, really, this idea was really inspired, in fact, by the hotel living. Although for Kaige, the idea was to shift hotel living from a kind of commodified form to really almost a project for public social housing, which, in fact, as you know, has always rejected anything that is not, in fact, the family, the apartment for the family. Of course, Kaige was also inspired by researchers that were conducted in Soviet Union between the 1920s and the early 30s, especially by the work of a group of architects who gathered around the OZA, which was a group led by the Vezdin brothers and especially by Mosè Ginzburg. During the existence of this loose group of architects, they published a magazine, Sovremennaye Architektura, which was, in fact, showcasing many of the projects and researchers by this group, among which actually communal living, communal dwelling was a very important aspect. One kind of projects that they propose, and of course, very few of these projects were realized, by the way. Only one actually became very well known, which is the Narkomfin by Ginzburg, but most of these projects remained on paper, and Ginzburg actually later on, when he published the book with all these researchers, he was almost forced to admit that basically what he had done was not following the right direction, let's say, of the party, because of course after the first quinquennial plan, 1928, there was really a shift of the Soviet Union towards a more kind of traditional forms of dwelling. And of course, this work by OZA was, in a way, kind of rejected. And it's interesting to see in this work of OZA, it's really much centered on this idea of the house that is not organized around apartments, but around rooms and around cells. So at first, they proposed this model known as the Dom Comuna, the communal housing, where you have actually all kind, like a hotel, you have all kind of collective amenities and facilities, and then this row of very small rooms for one person. This room actually is, if I'm not wrong, 6 square meters, so it's even smaller than Absalon cells. And the idea was to have as much as possible rooms for individuals small, and then to have a plethora of collective facilities. But of course, they soon realized that this model was problematic because it was forcefully forcing people to live together without giving them the chance to decide what kind of reciprocity they wanted to establish. So in a way, they went through the same dilemma of early Christian monks or Buddhist monks, how to balance individual and collective life. And that's actually the reason why in the 1930, Ginzburg took, in collaboration with the sociologist Mikhail Okitovich, they embarked in a series of projects known as Green City, of which they made several iterations. One of them was the entry for the new industrial city of Magnitogorsk, where they imagined actually this new city as a kind of dispersed settlement where there is, of course, a linear infrastructure, railways and motorways, and then a series of centralized amenities, restaurants and childcares and all kinds of domestic facilities, and then houses are just scattered as small individual dwellings, which this is actually a reconstruction that we have made, where these dwellings actually are literally cells for 1 or 2 persons, but with the possibility then to congregate these dwellings into more collective lodgings. Somehow the idea of Ginsburg and Okitovich was to define the settlement as a range of possibilities between the one-room person to collective livings, where in fact people could constantly adapt and decide how to balance these two conditions. And this is actually what makes, in my opinion, this project by Ginsburg one of the most radical forms of habitation against actually the hegemony of domesticity. And of course, one has to imagine that such a project could only take place in a settlement in a city where, of course, the property of land was no longer private, but it was public. So this is actually very important. We would never be able to realize such a project in a capitalist city where, in fact, land is owned by, only small parts are owned by the public, but most of it is owned by privates. So in a way, this project was really making sense within a situation where land was completely freed from private property. But of course, this abolition of private property came really with the abolition of the family. So in a way, this project was really drastically undermining the two fundamental institutions that until today actually rule our social condition. Now, it's interesting to me, and going towards the conclusion, that today actually there is a kind of return, a default return of the cell. I think this is the reason why the work of Absalon seems to resonate a lot today. I think one of the reasons why his work became maybe more important to many of us is because it resonates with this kind of return of the cell in the form of increasingly shrinking housing habitations. I think who has lived in cities like New York or London, or I think also Paris, might be familiar with this condition where more and more affordable apartments, affordable between quote unquote, are squeezed into very small rooms where kitchens and bedrooms and living rooms collapse almost into one space. Of course, what is really ironical about these micro flats is that they desperately try to maintain this kind of bourgeois decorum, although of course this bourgeois decorum completely collapsed because it's in the cell form. So the cell is actually really disintegrating this somehow bourgeois decorum of the home. Another return of the cell, of course, in this very commodified forms of co-living, which before the pandemic were very much on the rise. And so we have this, let's say, enterprises that really try to commercialize something that is actually known since a very long time. This is actually what I found also very problematic about these enterprises, that they try to sell as new something that has always existed, in fact. But of course, the difference is that while in the past hotel living was quite affordable, especially not only actually to workers, but also to elderly, to people, disabled people, people with problems of mental health, this actually form of hotel living or co-living is actually very expensive because, of course, is often built in cities where real estate is very high, and therefore it can only be affordable for wealthy people that can pay very high rents, and also to young people. So in a way, what was interesting about the residential hotel, it was that often it was a place for a refuge for all kinds of people that were also elderly or people with disabilities, while actually this kind of co-living is only affordable to people who can pay these very exorbitant rents. So in a way, again, we see we are confronted with this dilemma of the cell, the dilemma between whether the cell is a is really a desired, is an act of self-discipline, an act of self-enactment, let's say, or the cell is really a default condition, cellularization of society, an individuation of society. And perhaps the best image to conclude this dilemma, through which I've presented you this very concise history of the cell, is this famous photograph, which I'm sure you have seen many times. In my opinion, is one of the most beautiful but also disturbing, perhaps, image of modern architecture. It was a room staged by Hannes Meyer for an exhibition of the cooperative movement, the Swiss cooperative movement in Ghent. So he made a little theatrical stage and furnished it with a gramophone, a bed, the folded chair, the jars. I always ask myself, what is inside these jars? And this, it's a very beautiful picture. I mean, like Absalon cells are, it's both beautiful and threatening in a way. So there is this ambivalence, but I think the ambivalence is really, and which is the ambivalence of the cell, whether this really represents a moment of liberation, especially liberation for domestic space. In fact, the room is called co-op room, cooperative room, or is actually an image of our precarity of living, the fact that no matter what we do, we always end up confined into rooms, if we actually are lucky to have rooms, because of course there are a lot of people who cannot even find rooms to inhabit. So in a way, this image really, for me, embodied this kind of dilemma, dilemma of the cell between, let's say, self-discipline and imposition and self-confinement and confinement. Thank you.
Est-ce qu'on pourrait avoir des écouteurs pour Pier Vittorio s'il y a des questions en français?
Oui.
Merci beaucoup Pier Vittorio. Donc on va ouvrir un moment de questions, de réponses par rapport à cette présentation extrêmement riche. Les questions peuvent être adressées en français ou en anglais, selon vos souhaits.
Je vais aller de l'autre côté.
Okay. Et les questions doivent être transmises à travers le micro, comme ça sera retransmis aux personnes qui sont en train de nous suivre en direct et aussi pour notre enregistrement. Je ne vais pas toujours faire le même jeu de commencer moi à faire des questions, donc je vais me taire. Bon, vas-y Kent.
En anglais peut-être. Can I take off my mask? Oui, bonjour, hello. I'll speak in English. Kent Fitzsimons, I'm an associate professor at the School of Architecture and Landscape here. Thank you for this really stimulating talk. Proof once again that by talking about architecture, we talk about the world. And it's all the more impressive that we're just talking about a cell. It's a great feat. Three thoughts come to mind. One, the primitive hut idea. Can you make a relationship between this research you've done and the figure of the primitive hut in architecture's imagination? Second, to bridge that to the present and also a phenomenon now, the tiny house movement, which I'm sure you know about. Do you have a critical perspective on this strange phenomenon of the tiny house movement? And in between them, just have you looked at the YMCAs as a reform anti-single men problem in the US in the early 20th century, which produces interesting effects, but as a communal form of like the gymnasium, the swimming pool, three to choose.
Yes, no, I think it's really, these are very interesting questions. So regarding the primitive hut, of course, I think it's a very highly problematic archetype in architecture for two reasons. One, it because really legitimized the dwelling as a origin of architecture, and this is a very false assumption, because if, you know, in the history of the human species, we have built houses only in the very last bit of our history. Our history is 300,000 years long. We have become sedentary in the very last moment. So the idea, and in fact, we know that if there is such a thing like an original architecture, certainly were not dwellings, but were tombs. There were even monuments, temples that people built even when they were not yet sedentary. And so, therefore, I think it's a very highly problematic form, especially, you know, the idea that this primitive hut really already has a pitched roof, already looks like. In fact, certainly is not something that really is geared to give an impression that what people had to assume at that time was already present. It was timeless. So in that sense, I think that image is very problematic, and I found really strange that architects still use it as a kind of explanation, as a shortcut to explain what is the origin of architecture. And anyway, origins are always problematic. I think that's why I use the term genealogy, because I don't think there is an origin of the cell. We can only make a genealogy and find, let's say, here and there traces that could lead us to understand its development. The second question was about the
tiny house.
Tiny house. No, I think tiny house I found it very problematic. Of course, it's for obvious reasons. I think the problem with tiny houses, if there is such a thing like a tiny houses movement, is it really romanticizes this form of living, and if anything, we try to really problematize it. Although I think there is something interesting in the cell. Actually, our investigation is not just like a rejection. There is something interesting, but of course, I think the first thing, you know, what we are trying to do is to defamiliarize this. You know, we tried really to move away from the kind of glossy representation, the sublimation of it into this kind of, you know, small is good or less is more, you know, kind of thing. Regarding the third question, yes, of course, these are all interesting institutions that beginning of 20th century really try to, you know, with different, sometimes controversial intentions, try to actually give space to subjects that would not fit, you know, what the state and capital were expecting people to be. I mean, like, you know, housewives or breadwinners. So yes, I think that YMCA is certainly one of those institutions that even if, you know, without intentionally doing that, they were questioning fundamental premises of domestic life. And that's actually what I found interesting about the 19th century. You have all kinds of groups or communities that often, even without any revolutionary ideal, just the way their way of dwelling were somehow making fundamental attacks on bourgeois way of living.
Other questions? So there's another one there.
Hello, Christoph Katsaros, architectural critic. I have one remark and one question. The remark has to do with a discussion that has been taking place in France for a longer time about people becoming religiously radical in jail. So now, listening to you, I realized that there is, we thought along, and the story has it that they meet the bad guys over there and they become religious. Actually, I never thought that it could be so clear that actually it's the dwelling and the cell dwelling that could bring the metaphysical dimension to them, and so they would be. It's almost natural to become a radical in jail in regard to religion. The question that I have, and perhaps it's an invitation to add a little another layer to what you said, has to do with the sense we have that you take a model that we consider as alienating the individual cell, and you say, okay, it works like that. There is something even more alienating than this model, and it's called domesticity. Yet perhaps you could give us a bit more elements about why the domestic model is much more alienating finally than the individual model.
Yeah, no, of course, this is a crucial question, and in fact, is really the topic of many of the writings we have produced in the last decade. Actually, most of the work we produced at Dogma was really a research on the history of domestic space. And I think, of course, the alienation of domestic space comes, first of all, with the fact that it's something that we have accepted now as normal and as very familiar, even though this history has always been a history of oppression, a history of imposition of norms and ways of life, like even marriage or all these kind of institutions that for us are normal and becomes almost the aspiration of us. In a way, they have always been fabricated in order to produce a very specific subject. And we're not saying that we should reject that, of course, but I think we should be critical. And being myself also a teacher, I'm always very surprised how students since the first year are given as a first exercise to design a house, and of course the first things that they design is a family house, single family house or apartment, and they don't understand that there is an historicity of this institution. So we are not saying we should reject that. We should somehow be critical, especially now where, as Melinda Cooper has argued, family values are returning in a very strange way. So on one hand, on a material basis, the family is undermined, with the collapse of welfare state and all these kind of forms of support. But at the same time, as a juridical framework, is very strong. Actually, the state is still actually really trying to maintain as much as possible this institution. So, and of course, this kind of thing really produce all kinds of conflicts and forms of alienation that we cannot actually completely eradicate, but we have to confront in more radical way. For us, the cell is not so much the cell in itself, but is more a prop to really somehow formulate a critique of domestic space.
Est-ce qu'il y a encore des questions? I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say cell, you almost seem to imply a kind of like a very simplistic documentary, where cells come together, they create organism, and you have many examples of, sort of a kind of happy way out of loneliness through the common space where the cell dwellers, whether they're monks or other community, they can still meet together, no? And so I was wondering, what is your intuition or knowledge about which were the spaces of sociability of Absalon? Because there's a lot of emphasis in the exhibition or on all the narrative about the cells. I mean, these have been elevated into, yes, this kind of almost monument of the personage. But I have the intuition or the suspicion that there were other spaces of socialization from him that, of course, are not represented in his work, that probably were the counterbalance of this search for loneliness versus otherwise moments of, yes, exactly, of communal sharing.
Well, in the case of Absalon, for me, what I thought that was radical in his work was that this patient, he didn't design. There is this famous letter that Wittgenstein wrote after he finished the Tractatus. He said, well, the Tractatus is made of two parts, the one that I've written and the one that I have not written. And the most important one is the one that I have not written. So for me, actually, what is really radical about Absalon's work, that unlike actually many artists who always think immediately about the collective, he actually he went straight to this constrained space for himself. It's not even an individual space. Actually, it was a space for himself. And I think that for me, this was, of course, it's a very controversial move. No? He even said in a conversation that he was certainly not proposing these prototypes as a kind of universal models. He really thought these models for himself. So in that sense, I think that for me, what you call the space of conviviality, or it's actually very important in his work, but it's important because it's not there. It's something that somehow he decided to completely omit, but by that omission makes that space even stronger compared to actually the way we often, especially in architecture, try to banalize the space of communality or collectivity by this kind of saccharine-filled images of being together. So I think what is really interesting in Absalon's work, he really rejected that, and he even designed these prototypes almost like little bunkers. I think when the first time I saw them, and I knew that actually he had this military background, I said, well, I know where these prototypes come from. They look like little watchtowers. So there is something very hostile also in his work, which makes, I think, his decision to focus on this specific archetype of the cell even stronger. I think it would have been much weaker if he had decided to include also the, let's say, collective space.
Désolée, je vais parler en français. Bonsoir, je suis Sandra Patron, je suis la directrice du CAPC. Donc je suis absolument... Vous m'entendez?
The volume of the person who is translating is very low.
Okay.
You can change it.
Ah, okay.
So I can do it in English, but I'm so tired tonight.
Okay.
Try to, is it better?
Yes, yes.
Donc oui, je suis Sandra Patron, je suis la directrice du CAPC, donc qui présente cette exposition d'Absalon. Donc merci vraiment beaucoup. J'ai beaucoup aimé toute cette partie sur les moines. Mais je voulais un peu prolonger ce que disait Fabrizio, parce que pour moi, il y a quand même une ambivalence qui est assez peu mentionnée dans le travail d'Absalon. C'est que ces 6 cellules, j'aime bien le parallèle que vous faites avec le bunker, mais le bunker souvent sont sur les plages. Ces 6 cellules, finalement, dans leur hostilité, elles auraient pu tout à fait être situées absolument hors du monde. Or, il décide de les situer dans 6 métropoles urbaines, qui en plus pour lui sont les 6 villes représentatives du pouvoir de l'art. Donc Francfort, Paris, New York, Zurich, je vais en oublier... Tokyo et Tel Aviv, tout à fait. Effectivement, avec des éléments d'hostilité, la meurtrière sur celle de Tel Aviv, le côté tour de celle de Francfort. On a peu trouvé, on a essayé avec les commissaires de l'exposition de trouver des textes, des moments où Absalon explicite cette position à la fois en retrait et en même temps dans le monde. J'aurais voulu avoir votre sentiment là-dessus et comment justement vous analysiez cette relation entre un retrait presque hostile et en même temps une volonté d'être là où l'art se passe.
No, it's a very interesting example, and there is a parallel with monasticism. Somehow monks really were searching with this idea of solitude and moving away from society. That was at least initially the idea of monasticism. But then they were always strategic in locating themselves. I mean, the idea of the desert was more of a myth than a reality, because in fact they knew that they always needed to be not too far away from communities for many reasons, for reasons of self-sustenance, for reasons also to maintain some contact. I mean, okay, we can be alone, but maybe sometimes we can also know what's going on. And it's interesting. This is really provocative. You know, that's why monasteries are always built in very strange places. I mean, they never fit into a very, so they're distant and close at the same time. And I think in Absalon's work there is this tension a lot. I mean, you're right. I mean, these cells were not meant to be built in a very solitary place. They were built in very intense and global cities where actually, as you know, solitude becomes even more pressing as an experience than to live in the countryside. For example, where often the networks between communities are much stronger. So for me, it makes sense that he chose the city, which is really the place of solitary living par excellence. But also the fact that he chose these cities where, of course, in terms of the art world, were very, very important. I mean, he knew that as an artist, he could only survive, if he would be close to, I don't know, dealers or people interested in art, especially someone who, with his life had suffered, isolation and rejection from society. So it was important to be in these very cosmopolitan places because he knew that that was the only places where he would find an audience for his work. So in that sense, there is a very strong parallelism with monasticism because monks as well had this kind of, we're trying to balance these two conditions. Let's be away as much as possible, but let's not be too much away so that we don't lose the contact with the world. And in fact, I would say this is also something that we are constantly ourselves searching. No? We sometimes hate the city and living with others, but then after we move away, we feel maybe we should not move too much away. So I think there is something very, very extreme in Absalon that really summarizes this dilemma, which I think makes his work for me very interesting.
Encore des questions? Non, donc merci beaucoup à tous. Je vous donne rendez-vous pour nos 2 dernières rencontres avant les fêtes de la fin de l'année. Donc lundi 6 décembre, lundi prochain, nous allons avoir une rencontre autour de la ville de Lima au Pérou, donc une coproduction avec la mairie de Bordeaux et l'école d'architecture de Bordeaux, autour de pratiques de autoconstruction de participation citoyenne à Lima, qui d'ailleurs seront mises en tension avec des expériences bordelaises. Et 2 jours plus tard, donc une semaine encore intense, le mercredi 8 décembre, une conversation entre Françoise Fromonot, historien de l'architecture, et Michel Devigne, architecte du paysage, à partir de l'exposition Arboretum et à propos des projets de paysage et de botanisme architectural de Michel Devigne. Merci beaucoup et à la semaine prochaine. Bonsoir.